So, on the recommendation of a friend who is very pro-reason and pro-science and pro-human, I read the global warming section of Enlightenment Now, which is supposedly, and I'm sure in many ways, pro-reason, pro-science, and pro-human. But this chapter is really bad, and I think in fairly obvious ways. And so the refutation is not obvious, but the methodology I think should be very suspicious. And what I worry about is people getting really excited about a book because somebody is directionally right or maybe is doing many things right, but has bad methodology, which then can lead to bad conclusions. And if you don't have expertise in the field, then you can unwittingly end up recommending stuff that has bad conclusions. So just one idea that will come out of what I'm about to say, and it'll only take a couple minutes, is just that as readers, and particularly insofar as we have had the benefit of being familiar with Ayn Rand's methodology and epistemology, we just need to be really careful about the methodology of the things that we praise and endorse, because that's really our only protection. Right? I mean, as a knowledge consumer, your number one protection is your knowledge of methodology, because you're not going to have expertise. And one thing that I hope to help with long term is with what I call Human Flourishing Project, to give knowledge consumers better practical epistemology to process things. So I just want to go over a couple of things that I noticed, and I'll try to distinguish between what I think is apparently suspicious and then where I think I have specialized knowledge that someone else might not have. So let's just read through this. As gigatons of carbon laid down during the Carboniferous period have gone up in smoke, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has risen from about 270 parts per million before the Industrial Revolution to about 400 parts today. This is an aside, but I really don't like when people talk about carbon and smoke, because carbon dioxide is clear. You see all kinds of stupid images with that now. His could be taken a slightly different way, but that's just a small thing, but it's annoying. Since CO2, like the glass in a greenhouse, traps heat radiating from the Earth's surface. So that's, okay, this is kind of a specialized thing. It doesn't really work like that, so it's not that great. Yeah, that's, you can look into that, but that's not true. Okay, but since CO2, traps heat, the global average temperature has risen by about 0.8 degrees Celsius, 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is something where this is a pretty simple kind of causal relationship being asserted, and there's no evidence given and there's no complexity acknowledged. And if you see the graph of this kind of thing, you see that it goes up until 1940 and then goes down and then goes up and then goes flat. So there's something pretty far from a direct causal relationship. And then if you look throughout history, then it's a complete mess, because you see there are much bigger factors. But in this, when somebody asserts something like this baldly, especially if you know that there are smart people who disagree, including like really famous scientists like Freeman Dyson, or the people in Alabama who basically invented modern satellite measurement. Now you might not know that, but just this kind of simple attribution, I think, is suspicious. Okay, so then he goes into, it could become warmer still in a runaway feedback loop of white heat absorbing snow and ice, blah blah blah. Not to just skip over that, but just this another extremely complex thing being posited. If you start to think about even like, okay, well, what might be evidence for this? Like, what happened in the history of the Earth when CO2 was a lot higher? And has it ever been higher? And yeah, it turns out it's been 10 to 20 times higher. And why wasn't there this kind of crazy feedback loop before? And why didn't just everything completely overheat? And is it super hot now? Well, no, it was actually way hotter before. It's actually really cold by the standards of the climate. So we'll get back to that. But this is just, I think we should at least be suspicious just from having a general like historical context and then an idea of the complexity of things. I think this is dubious. Okay, but now this is going to really test just what you can say by asserting something. So if the emission of greenhouse gas continues, the Earth's average temperature will rise to at least 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level by the end of the 20th century, and perhaps to 4 degrees Celsius. So where does this come from? This is just an incredible kind of prediction. And you might ask, well, and this is the first chapter of Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, what is the track record of these predictions? It's very bad. They overpredict chronically. What are the mechanisms by which they claim to be able to predict? Do we have any evidence that these are valid? And then let's continue on. This will cause more frequent and more severe heat waves, more floods in wet regions, more droughts in dry regions, more severe hurricanes, lower crop yields in warm regions. I mean, at least there he'd have to say all things being equal, because he points out surely how technology increases crop yields and could make those kinds of other factors irrelevant by comparison. So this is just all this extreme assertion of causality with no evidence, and just super simple, like simpler than it could possibly be. So what's the justification for doing this kind of thing? I mean, and for reading it, and how are we supposed to take it in if he doesn't give us any sense of the complexity or the actual mechanisms or the doubts involved? How are you supposed to process this? And this is a book that's been called great by many people who are big fans of Ayn Rand. This has been called, I think, his favorite book ever by Bill Gates. So this is just, I think that we as consumers should be suspicious. And we get into sea level rise. This is another thing where you might not know all the science, but you should ask just for historical context. Like, for example, you've probably heard of something called an ice age, and we came out of an ice age in the last 10, 20,000 years. And if you look at Wikipedia, you'll see that sea level rise is way, way, way faster 10,000 years ago than it is today. And yet today we have technology and we can deal with it. So why are we so afraid of this relatively tiny sea level rise compared to the past? And what about the different technological solutions? And isn't this a book about technology and how technology can solve everything? But seemingly when it comes to global warming, technology can't solve anything except by withdrawing carbon from the world. And we should be open to that, and he supports nuclear power, and that's great. But he's just accepted this kind of linear doomsday narrative when it comes to the issue that probably not coincidentally is the hardest socially to challenge. That is, if he were to challenge climate catastrophism, he would get in a lot of trouble. So I don't know his motives, but it's worth noting that the most controversial issue is the one that he's most dogmatic on. This is similar issue with Sam Harris, although Sam Harris doesn't go into nearly this level of detail. So Pinker gets a lot more credit than Sam Harris on this. But at the same time, Sam Harris only published a really bad podcast on this. He didn't publish a book that's claiming to just document the exact nature of the world. All right, so he talks all of these are the same kind of thing. They're just these assertions without evidence that seem to contradict what we know from history, and that seem to contradict maybe kind of obvious technological approaches. And then we get to the climax. A rise of 2 degrees Celsius is considered the most that the world could reasonably adapt to. And a rise of 4 degrees Celsius, in the words of a 2012 World Bank report, simply must not be allowed to occur. So I just have to jump on this World Bank thing for a second. I hate this practice of just taking one authority and then quoting them and making that seem like reality. Now, if you have data and you can show that it's universal, then cite the data or cite some definitive model. But just one thing I tried to do in Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and one thing I did do, is not one conclusion in that book rests on anyone else being quoted. It's just the data, and then here's the analysis of the data. Quotes maybe 3 people the whole time, but that's just because they found a good way of wording a point. So this does not convince me at all that the World Bank said things. The World Bank says many, many, many wrong things. It probably says more wrong things than right things when it comes to its predictions of the future. But this 2 degrees Celsius, how is this possibly plausible that the most we could reasonably adapt to is 2 degrees Celsius? Everything is getting better, but the one thing we cannot handle is weather or sea level rise. This is just so conventional. And my point mainly here is not to criticize Pinker, but for us to be ambitious knowledge consumers who think critically about things, even when people are saying things that we're really excited about, or even when they get many things right. Let's see. So we go to the challenge is daunting, and then okay, let's go to now one response to the prospect of climate change. This is, by the way, super vague terminology. The prospect of climate change. Climate change is a constant of nature. So you would talk about something like catastrophic warming impact of man-made CO2. Just this lack of precision is just something that you should just always be suspicious about. Okay, so now we're talking about hypotheses. Now it goes into a recent survey found that exactly 4 of 69,406 authors of peer-reviewed articles in scientific literature rejected the hypothesis of anthropogenic global warming, and that the peer-reviewed literature contains no convincing evidence against the hypothesis. Now, there have been many criticisms of these kinds of 97%, or this is a variety like 99.99 whatever percent, and he does not acknowledge this at all. And by the way, one of the books cited in here is The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. Not cited, but included at whatever appendix at the end as books you could possibly read on this subject. But that book, and I'm sure others that are cited by him, totally challenges all of the fallacies of this. So there's just a ton there, but you should at least know, if you've been reading this and you've been reading smart people, including if you've read me on this, you should just know that there are other arguments, and this is not an accurate representation. But it gets much worse. Nonetheless, a movement within the American political right, heavily underwritten by fossil fuel interests, has prosecuted a fanatical and mendacious campaign to deny that greenhouse gases are warming the planet. So I don't know what citation he has here. I don't want to get off this thing, but what is this? This is just, if you actually look at the people involved, one common denominator is that most of them say that there is a greenhouse effect, that warming does exist, but they say that it's extremely overpredicted historically, that we can adapt to it. And they say all sorts of very reasonable things that are not, it's not appropriate to dismiss it as a fanatical and mendacious. And how do you know the motives of people? And aren't these, by the way, the case for recent science, humanism, and progress? Arguably, it's that mendacious industry that's done the most to advance progress, because it's provided the energy that's powered everything that's made possible for us, among other things, to have all kinds of time to get knowledge that people like Steven Pinker can either get valid or invalid knowledge, but that in the aggregate has been tremendously beneficial. And then he talks about this issue of physical scientists have no such agenda. Notice that in this whole thing, there's no addressing of the arguments of the opposition. And this is one case where we should be really suspicious as knowledge consumers. What is really the best argument for the other side? And I'll give you an argument that he does not address. In terms of the agenda of the scientists, the argument would be that since the 1980s, a massive increased funding of climate science has been to answer the question, how badly are CO2 emissions destroying the planet and endangering human beings? So the whole framing of modern climate science, the whole motivation was concern about CO2, and the whole set of questions is very narrowly focused on CO2 rather than understanding broader climate dynamics. So just with that kind of biased starting question, you can bias a whole field even if nobody is mendacious. Now, in terms of mendacious, he should know, and we should know if we read anything, that there was something called ClimateGate, and there was a lot of mendacity there, and that a lot of rules were broken in the name of promoting this. So I don't, the fact that you consider yourself a watchdog for politically incorrect dogma, you cannot not be familiar with this, so you at least have to address it. Now, you might say, well, he's got to cover a lot of things in this book, so I'm putting a big burden on him by saying that he actually has to explain cause and effect, and actually has to be precise, and actually has to address counter-arguments. Yeah, that is a burden, but maybe you can't write a book like this accurately if you're just claiming to be sort of a universal synthesizer of all knowledge about human progress. But the point is, if you can't do that, you can't, but it's really irresponsible to do it this way. So I'm almost done because I think I've made my basic points. Let's just see if there's anything else. Then there's he cites William Nordhaus. Now, this is, again, just taking one particular person. In a sense, this is even worse than than the World Bank thing. So this is just a kind of Pascal's wager. Well, if there's a 5% chance that it'll pass a tipping point and face catastrophe, it would be prudent to take preventative action, even if the catastrophic outcome is not certain. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, but I'm sure Pinker has an argument somewhere in his work against Pascal's wager and the fallacy there. And here, the fallacy is very similar, except that in this case, what we're talking about in terms of restricting fossil fuel energy is something that we know. Every time we do anything to make energy more expensive or less reliable or more scarce, that directly harms people. So that's a very harmful kind of insurance policy, and the kinds of policies being favored by many people Pinker's allying with are talking about 80% reductions in today's use, and this is in a world with 3 billion people who have almost no energy. So it's completely irresponsible to just act as if, oh, all the risk is in adding more CO2 to the atmosphere, when in fact there is massive and certain risk and certain death, if you're talking about enough of this, in significant restrictions of fossil fuel energy in the name of reducing CO2. So instead of a responsible, careful cost-benefit analysis where you actually gave evidence for causation and then you actually addressed the arguments against you, including mine in the book that you cited, but didn't address in this book, this is just, you can't do this, or you can't do it responsibly. By the way, then just to go here, in one of the more surreal episodes in the history of environmental politics, this is Naomi Klein, joined the infamous David and Charles Koch, the billionaire oil industrialists and bankrollers of climate change denial, and helping to defeat a 2016 Washington state ballot initiative that would have implemented the country's first carbon tax, the policy measure which almost every analyst endorses as a prerequisite to dealing with climate change. I mean, how much appeal to authority and just irresponsible conventionality, how much do you know about Charles Koch and what he's done? Because I know a lot about Charles Koch, and Charles Koch is the number one person in the world, in probably the history of the world, who has devoted money to pro-liberty causes. And this is somebody who has had dozens and dozens of death threats on his head. And he didn't need to do any of this. He could have just hung out at cocktail parties and impressed Steven Pinker, surely, like many other oil executives. But he has done what he thinks is right. So maybe if he's done this, maybe he's against a carbon tax, maybe he's got a really good reason for it instead of being another mendacious kind of person. So just to close, this is not the most important part of it, but it is important that by being conventional and even parasitical and certainly irresponsible, Pinker is denouncing what I believe is a very good man, even a great man, and he is not giving sufficient evidence to do it. But more broadly, what he is doing is he is not giving a sufficient explanation of why we should radically reduce our use of fossil fuels. He's using appeals to authority. He's using incomplete explanations. And to go back to my point from the beginning of this, it's bad that Pinker's doing this, but it's our fault as knowledge consumers if we just pass this along and say that it's amazing. We really have to have really high standards of methodology. And if you want to encapsulate what you should generally look for, my own things that I look for are, one, I always want to be clear. I always want the writer to be clear, anyone to be clear on what they think the right goal is. When we're talking about different choices, they have to also be clear on what the choice is, define the choice clearly. So that would be the first one. Define the choice clearly. So in this case, do we pass radical restrictions on fossil fuels? And then define the goal, which I think Pinker would agree would be something along the lines of, we want the policy that most advances human flourishing now and in the future. And then here's the part that's really not done. We need to look carefully at the different alternatives, which means we need to look carefully at the pros and cons of each. We can't just look recklessly at the cons of fossil fuels and not look at the pros. And part of being careful is that we use clear terminology, not vague things like climate change. And we give really clear evidence. We don't give appeals to authority, or even in some cases, in Pinker's case, no appeals to authority. And we give causal explanations of things. So at least on this issue, this book is a bad book, and we should not recommend it on this issue. And if we recommend it on other issues, we should make clear that it is bad on this issue. And I hope that people challenge Pinker to up his methodology. And if he wants to talk to somebody who's thought a little bit more carefully about this issue, he can email alex@alexepstein.com.